Let me ask you a question. What are your reasons for absolutely needing a spike on the back of your axe? What are your reasons for absolutely not wanting a spike on the back of your axe? Hey folks, Matt Easton here, Schola Gladiatoria. Now, most of you will know that axes throughout the world, at least everywhere that invented them, have been extremely successful and popular weapons, and obviously tools originally. Or which came first, the weapon or the tool, we don't know. But Stone Age axes obviously were around in the Stone Age, and they transferred into metallic axes later on. Bronze Age first, and then Iron Age, steel, and so on and so forth. Now, throughout the entire history of the axe, some axes, in fact probably most, have not had any form of thing on the back. However, throughout the world and throughout a lot of different cultures, many axes have indeed had something on the back. And here we're going to be looking at a spike. So we're going to look at 3 reasons why you absolutely want a spike on the back of your axe, but also 3 reasons why you absolutely don't want a spike on the back of your axe. So first thing to mention is that in fact, spikes on the back of axes aren't always a fighting feature. We do find tool axes which have a spike on the back, and it's usually so that you can ram the spike into a log, for example, and drag it along. But sometimes it's for another particular use. So the axe on the front is obviously for chopping wood, and the spike on the back might be for something else. It might be a pick, for example, for digging with. So spikes on the back of axes are probably something that predate the designs of specific fighting axes, but people found that they were quite useful for fighting with. Now, at least in medieval European history, generally speaking, axes don't have a spike on the back until we get into about the 12th century, when they start to have spikes on the back. So things like this Danish great axe here, as featured on the Bayeux tapestry and used by the housecarls, axes almost exactly like this start to appear in manuscript and other art in the 12th and certainly by the 13th century, which have spikes added to the back. And this leads us to the primary purpose, I think, for adding a spike on the back, and that is armour. So it's probably patently clear to most of you why you might want the spike on the back of your axe for fighting an armour. Well, first of all, we should say that certainly something as big and fearsome as this massive Great Dane axe here is still going to be effective for fighting an armour to some extent because it is big. However, if we just grab the typical armour of the day, which is mail, okay? So mail is the principal and primary armour being worn in the so-called Dark Ages, the early medieval period, and into, let's say, the 11th, 12th, and even into the 13th century. This is what most people are relying on. Now, axes are certainly good at just hitting someone really, really hard. And obviously, if you hit them in the head or they're not wearing armour, it's gonna be perfectly effective as it is. However, if you're dealing with increasing numbers of armoured opponents who are wearing mail armour, this is a really good way of compromising mail. And in fact, as we get into the plate armour period as well, when someone's fully encased in plate cuirass, the axe starts to become really just a bludgeoning weapon. You're never going to cut through plate armour with an axe, and in fact most people would probably agree you can't really cut through mail armour with an axe. So by and large, the axe blade becomes a bludgeoning instrument, and if you want to pierce anything, you really need the smallest point possible. So much the same as with a pick or a warhammer, these on the back here perform exactly the same function, whether it's through mail or whether it's aiming for gaps in plate armour where there would also be mail, or indeed if it's like an open face helmet or things like this. This kind of spike, which will be able to get through smaller gaps, through smaller holes, which an axe blade might not fit through, for example in an armpit or back of a leg, that is very, very important. So the primary purpose for having a spike on the back of the axe, I think we can say, unless it's a tool, is an anti-armour device. Now, the second reason why you might want a spike on the back of here is actually not something which is unique to having a spike, and it is hooking. What do I mean by that? Well, one of the nice features of axes compared to something like a knife or a sword, for example, is you have this 90-degree angle. But a lot of people forget that you also have a 90-degree angle up here as well. So when we look at the poleaxe treatises, such as Le Jus de la Hache or the anonymous Bolognese sauce of the 15th century, 16th centuries, Looking at the use of pole axes, like this one over here, we find that this angle is used in a couple of really important ways. The bottom edge here is used for hooking things. It could be hooking an opponent's weapon out of their hands or pulling their weapon forwards. It could be hooking around the back of the head, around the back of the leg, inside of the arm. Hooking anything, basically. So as a hook, much like the sickle that we see in Japanese martial arts. But a lot of people forget that this has an equally good pushing potential as well. So for pushing or pulling, this 90 degrees angle is a really, really useful thing. But we've only got one of them. One of the beauties of things which have two, and of course this applies to pole axes as well, is not only can you use this for hooking, but now you can also use this for hooking. You can use that for pushing and that for pushing. And in some situations, because you've got a much bigger added horizontal space, you can even block with this. So if someone's swinging something at your head, for example, you don't have to block with the shaft like this or like this. You can actually block with the top. And again, this is something we explicitly see in poleaxe treatises where one weapon is caught in the croc, as it were, or the cross, le croix, in the le jus de la hache in the French, in the cross of the top here. So, whether it's hooking with the bottom on either side or pushing or blocking with the top on either side, having a spike sticking out really increases your options. So the third and final thought that I'm going to give for why you might want a spike on the back of here is, when we're looking at swords, one of the big notable difference between a single-edged sword, I'll just grab a single-edged sword here, and a double-edged sword is that when you cut with the single-edged sword, it passes through the front edge, and if you want to cut with the cut backwards going back upwards again, you have to turn the blade around to cut. Okay, so you come down one way, you turn and come back up. Now one of the beauties of a double-edged sword, of course, is you can do this, cut down and immediately back up from any angle, or indeed down and up that way, so you can cut in both directions without turning the blade around. Now obviously this is absolutely translatable to an axe as well. Single-edged axe, if I cut down this way and miss, or the person steps back or deflects and I come down and I want to cut, I've got to turn it around to come back up. But one of the beauties of having essentially a double-edged or double-faced axe is you can come down one way and immediately come back the other way. And this means you come in from angles, sometimes unexpected, coming around a person's guard, sometimes hitting them in their defensive motions, in their hands and their arms. And so you can wound in two directions without having to turn your weapon around. So this is amazing. You might be thinking, well, why on earth would anyone even bother, once it's been invented, why would anyone even bother having a single-bladed axe like a simple axe here, when you can add a spike on the back and it instantly becomes way more versatile? Why wouldn't everybody do that? Well, there's three reasons coming up here, and the first one is weight, and connected to that, cost or economy, if you like. So quite simply, if you're putting more metal onto the end of your shaft, so to speak, then it's going to make your axe more expensive. So making an axe like this is really quite a lot more expensive than making an axe like this in two ways. Firstly, it costs more because it's got more metal in it, and okay, you could say, okay, well, I'll make the head a bit smaller or a bit thinner or a bit lighter, and so I'm using the similar amount of steel. But even if you do that, and that's not normally the case, but even if you do that, then it takes more work. As someone who's dabbled a tiny bit in blacksmithing, as you might have seen on my channel with my friend Will Sherman and Paul Binns and various others, forging something with, and this is quite a lot of work, okay? For someone who isn't well practiced, forging the eye of an axe and a blade is quite a lot of work. But if you're now trying to do that with a spike as well, whether it's forged in one piece or whether the spike is forge welded on after you've made the socket, there's various ways of doing it, it's a lot more work. And time equals money as well, because if it takes twice as long to make this as one of these, well, you could have made two of these, you could have equipped two of your soldiers with weapons as opposed to one. So more time, potentially more material, more cost, and weight. Okay, generally speaking, yes, okay, there are weight saving measures, but generally speaking, in most cases with historical axes or recreations, one which has something on the back is pretty much always heavier than a single-edged one. Why does that matter? You could say that weight adds a bit more momentum and would have more effect on the target, but fundamentally it means that single-edged, single-bladed axes, like little tomahawks, are quicker than those ones with the spike on the back. Again, you can make lighter ones, and you can make them so they're quite minimal, so it might not be very much, might not be very noticeable. And this is, despite the fact this has got two faces, this is still a very light and quick little thing. You can make it different sizes, you can make the blades more. So weight isn't always a factor, but pound for pound, generally speaking, if you add something onto an axe, it's going to add weight. And of course, the ultimate expression of this argument is the poleaxe, which is just about the most expensive type of axe ever invented, and one of the heavier ones. They're not ludicrously heavy, but they do tend to weigh about 5 or 6 pounds. So compared to anything like a tomahawk or a one-handed axe, they are a lot bigger, heavier things. And yeah, they're used in two hands, they're predominantly used in armour, or at least against armour. So that doesn't matter, that's a trade-off that's worth making. But the more and more you add on to the weapon and the more complex you make it, the more expensive it gets, the more time-consuming it gets to make, and very often the heavier it ends up being. So the second reason why I genuinely, for practical everyday uses, probably wouldn't choose an axe with a spike on the back unless I was really certain I was going to be facing armoured opponents, is danger. Danger to myself, and not just myself, the people around me, my friends, my comrades, and my horse, if I've got one. So whether you're carrying an axe around, worn on your belt, hung from a saddle ring, for example, if you're a knight, or, you know, if you're just kind of a traveling kind of hunter-gatherer or whatever, it is far more risky to carry this around with that really spiky spike on the back than it is to carry something like a typical 18th century trade tomahawk, for example. This is far easier to wear safely, far less likely to spike you in your kidneys or your friends or your horse. So that's way easier to make safe. And even if it's got a super sharp blade, which incidentally this one does, which is why I'm being very careful with it, you can cover one blade pretty easily, but to sort of holster or cover both sides is far more involved. Now, I know in the modern world there are certain types of holsters where you slide the thing down and both sides are enclosed. There is almost no evidence of those historically. Okay, so historically they don't seem to have existed. So this type of axe, which may have been the type of axe that someone like Robert the Bruce might have used, for example, at the Battle of Bannockburn, really not that easy to wear, not that easy to carry around. And safety, there is another thing, and this is actually the main reason why I probably wouldn't pick one of these unless I really needed a spike for fighting against armour. That is, if you're using the axe, as you swing back, that spike is always coming back towards you. Now, I don't know about you guys, but I find that really disconcerting, and I even notice it when I make thumbnails for my videos, because whenever I hold the axe, I always want the axe blade to be pointing away from my face, because that's what looks right on a thumbnail, which means that that spike is pointing towards my face. And I don't like that. I've had enough pointy things pointed towards my face in my life to know that that distance to my eyes is not a very nice thing. So fighting with a weapon with the axe blade out, having that point pointed towards you is nasty because it's not even in the line with the main shaft, it's projecting beyond it. I'm not a big fan of it. If you've got the point away from you, I'm actually happier about using the weapon like that, but still I've now got a projecting blade towards me. So personally, I'm not a huge fan of having a big spike pointing towards me while I'm trying to hit someone or just waving a weapon around like I am right now. But as mentioned, if I was a 12th century infantryman my grandfather had used a Dane axe, for example, at the Battle of Hastings or Stamford Bridge or something like this, and I was now finding myself living in a period where almost all of the soldiers on the battlefield that I'm facing have mail armour and, you know, good helmets with mail coifs and mail mittens, well, in that situation I might, despite the fact that this is still a weapon that's still around, I mean these were still around at the time of Cressy, they're shown on 14th century artwork even without anything on the back. But if I could, in that period, I think that's the period, you know, 13th, 14th century, where I'm going to have to go, look, I'm going to need a spike on the back of here because this just isn't really cutting the mustard anymore. But in many other situations, I would not choose a spike on the back of my axe, I'd just choose a simple axe blade. So the last and final reason why I might not want a spike on the back of my axe, and in fact in many cases I wouldn't, and I would stick with a simple axe with a simple blade sticking out one direction here, is simply spikes get stuck. Okay, it doesn't matter whether it's a rapier or a dagger or a bayonet that you're thrusting, or a spear, a boar spear, or whether it's a warhammer or the spike on the back of an axe, especially with a top-heavy weapon which has a lot of momentum. You can fully expect when swung into a soft target, or even into mail, it might even be worse with mail, that this blade, this entire blade, is going to sink into the target. In some cases, even if you're hitting a helmet, and we know because we've got square holes in helmets surviving archaeologically, that going into a helmet will produce a square hole and could get stuck. So whether it's a body, a clothed body, whether it's padded armour like a gambeson, or whether it's mail, which might also grip that blade like steel sheet would in a slightly different way, but similar result, this can get stuck. An axe blade, far less likely to get stuck, and moreover, from testing on various targets, we've found that axe blades that go into a target, if they do get momentarily stuck, if you wiggle them like that, they tend to cut themselves free. Whereas a spike that goes into a target, if you wiggle it, it still stays stuck. And you can experiment this whether it's on wood or whether it's meat or, you know, ballistic gel, whatever. You can embed that into the target and embed that into the target, and you will find the spike is far more likely to get stuck than the blade is, which produces a longer, thinner hole, like a slot, which is easier to get out of. The square hole produces a lot of surface friction and is really not easy to get out. So, there we go. You decide, what would you choose in what scenarios for general purpose? Let's say you were a trapper in the 18th century in North America, or let's say you were in, you know, I don't know, the Roman era, for example. You were a tribesman in Teutoburg Forest, or you were in the sort of 12th century medieval period where lots of people have got mail armour but plate hasn't come along yet, or you're in the period of plate armour. These are all different contexts that would lead to different results, and obviously some very specialised types of axe were evolved for the last of those scenarios. But we get into an interesting period, particularly in the sort of Dark Ages period, where you've got a mixture of armour and not armour, or equally in the sort of 12th, 13th century period. You know, would you choose a simple bladed axe? Would you choose a spike on the back? Or even with a two-handed one, would you feel the need to have the back spike on your what would have been a simple Dane axe in the 11th century? So there we go. Clearly something was evolved for a specific set of purposes. They have a range of advantages, but also, like many things in life, a range of disadvantages. Thanks a lot for watching. Please check that you are subscribed, give me a like, and I hope I'll see you back on the channel really soon. Cheers, folks. Thanks for watching. We've got extra videos on Patreon. Please give our Facebook a like and subscribe if you haven't already. Cheers, folks.